Welcome back, sports fans. This is a video that I've been contemplate doing for a long time. Not that I'm getting old, not that I'm getting sentimental, but, excuse me, but I'm getting old and a little sentimental. And in my old age, it makes me think back to the past and athletes that obviously I was a big fan of, and athletes that were the first people to get my attention in sports. So I came up with a list of top 10 athletes throughout my life who've been big inspirations and not role models, because they weren't really specifically role models, and not hero worshiping, but obviously as a young kid, there was a little bit of hero worshiping involved in this. So I'm going to go through this list, break it down a little bit, and talk about the top 10 athletes that impacted me as a child growing up, left a big impression. So let's go through this. This is not in a particular order. This is just me scrolling across the page. So the first guy is Bobby Orr. I had a Bobby Orr Bruins jersey when I was 4 years old. That was the first birthday present, first Christmas present I really remember. And maybe it's just because there was a picture of me wearing it, so obviously that sticks in my head. But I'm from Toronto, but I was a huge Boston fan, right? Which is only because Bobby Orr played for Boston. At one time, Bobby Orr was considered the best Canadian hockey player in the world. He was a defenseman who scored tons of goals, literally would grab the puck behind his net and bring it all the way up the ice, through the defense, through the offense, through the wingers and everybody, to end up leading to goals and assists. Only because it was the 70s and the rough tactics and treatment that he had to endure as a player, the reason his career didn't go longer and he didn't have a bigger impact. He obviously still had a huge impact, but Bobby Orr was really my first athlete to really grab my attention as a young kid. Obviously, I'm from Canada. He's from Ontario as well as I'm from Ontario. So he was a big player that I really paid attention to growing up. And as I say, this is not in a particular order. Next is Len Bias. I don't know if you guys remember Len Bias, but Len Bias played for Maryland Terrapins. And obviously the ACC at that time was a great division. The Big East with St. John's and Syracuse and Georgetown, Patrick Ewing, Mullen, Pearl Washington, Ron Cycli, all that group of players. The Big East was unbelievable. But the ACC was also unbelievable. You had Jordan, James Worthy, Sam Perkins, all for North Carolina, Sleepy Floyd. And then one of the outliers was Maryland. Maryland was that team you liked because they weren't like America's team. They weren't like the North Carolina and Dukes that were getting all the attention. And this was a little bit before Duke really got all their attention. North Carolina State was up there a little bit with Jimmy Valvano, and of course teams like Villanova in the Big East, which were kind of underdogs, but still unbelievable teams able to pull the upset, right? Obviously Villanova beating Georgetown. But this guy was phenomenal. Jordan was that guy. On every cover, had won the NCAA March Madness tournament as a freshman, hitting a big shot. And then obviously, everybody under him was kind of second fiddle. But Len Bias was no second fiddle. Len Bias was a man's man. 6'8", 210, 220, I'm not sure what he weighed. The dude's vertical was fucking unbelievable. He was kind of Dominique Wilkins before Dominique Wilkins went to Georgia and got all the attention. He was a monster. A monster. And the best games ever in the ACC were Jordan Len Bias games, where they would try to one-up each other on each side of the floor. It was kind of like Dominique Wilkins when he played Larry Bird, right? Boston, Atlanta. They had the same kind of back and forth that went on. And another reason this was such an impactful point was because I'm not a Boston Celtics fan. I'm not a Duke fan. I know I'm not a brother, but growing up playing basketball, I hung out with all the brothers. So I was not a fan of Laettner and Hurley, Bird and Parrish, and these people, Danny Ainge, who actually played baseball in Toronto. So I mean, you know, even though I had a connection with him because he was a Toronto Blue Jay, I still was never a fan of Boston. But when they signed Reggie Lewis, and the way he was playing, and then they signed Len Bias, all of a sudden, I was ready to be the biggest Boston Celtics fan in history. With Reggie Lewis, Larry Bird, McHale, Len Bias, my God, this Boston was everything the other Boston wasn't. Athletic, swag, right? Len Bias would have been a superstar. And to only have my hopes crushed, but as well of obviously his and people around him and people who had more of a connection to him than obviously me, a kid from Toronto. But I was devastated when Len Bias died just after being drafted number 3 by Boston. It was brutal, brutal. Very terrible news. At that point, you know, we all grew up around drugs. This was when crack was a big thing in Canada and the States. So we all knew about crack kills and the whole sort of crack situation, which, you know, really became a plague when I was in high school. But this was just a real eye-opener, right? That this athlete, this genetic specimen, could sniff a few lines of cocaine and end up having a heart attack, right? Nobody could have ever imagined that this would have happened. I mean, I've snorted lines of coke, and I'm not a genetic fucking phenomena, and my heart was okay. So it makes you really think about how life is and how anything can happen at any time. Like I just heard the drummer for Foo Fighters died. He's younger than me, right? And he kind of died with the same sort of situation. 13 different narcotics in his blood system. But when Len Bias died, it was a real wake-up call. And I was really disappointed because I was never a Jordan fanatic. Of course, I grew up a Jordan fan, but because I was a Dr. J fan, I was always a 76ers fan, right? So I never really supported Bird and the Boston Celtics. I never supported really Magic and the Lakers. So I was getting ready to be a big fan of Len Bias, and then of course this happened, which was super disappointing. Another athlete that really impacted me, a machine, a monster, a guy that had a will to win, no quit. And his team was one of the more exciting teams in the NFL at this time. The Bears, right? Like that whole thing, the Bears became pop culture-esque. And the guy that was the motor for the Bears was not the fridge, was not McMahon. It was Walter Payton. Walter Payton was a monster, a machine, right? A guy whose summer workouts were legendary. And so it was no surprise that he was such a phenomenal player. And I was a huge fan of his work ethic, his style, him stiff-arming fucking linebackers and dudes, you know, showing his power to just run through and run over guys, even though he wasn't the biggest of running backs, not even the fastest, but he was a great running back. I also liked Marcus Allen, who came out of USC at that time, obviously went to the Raiders. I was a big Raiders fan at that time as well. So, you know, there's other players that obviously I liked. I like Montana and Jerry Rice for the 49ers a lot. Being from Canada, of course, I'm not affiliated specifically to an NFL team. So I've mostly followed players and teams that had players that I liked. Generally, those were the teams that I watched. We have a couple boxers here, and I've mentioned these guys constantly, so it's no surprise to anybody, but Sugar Ray Leonard, who obviously in 1976, when I was 8 years old, went to Montreal and won the gold medal in the Olympics. Obviously, being an 8-year-old in Canada with this guy being, you know, this phenomenal athlete, big smile, charismatic boxer, quick hands, power, everything you want in a boxer, right? He epitomizes boxer puncher, right? The ability to adjust in the ring, the heart, the tenacious toughness, a great chin. Like, really, Sugar Ray Leonard had everything. And much like some other athletes before him, Because of that, he was also very hated because people were jealous of him, right? Which is why a lot of people were Tommy Hearns fans, me being a little younger, and obviously being swept up by the smile and the glamour. I was much more, of course, a Sugar Ray Leonard fan, doing commercials, his kid on the commercials. Whereas Tommy Hearns was much more of a blue collar type of guy. And, from Detroit, people really gravitated towards him. Or Duran, who obviously, at this point, me being a kid from Canada, my experience with Latin American fighters wasn't that much. Of course, most of the information I got was from American TV. So most of the athletes I liked were Americans. Many of them black Americans, because those were the ones who were highlighted and dominating the sports that I was watching, such as Dr. J, who also is on this list. The first time I met Dr. J, and I meet not literally, but figuratively, was when he was on Sesame Street. Dr. J was on Sesame Street. Me being a little kid watching Sesame Street, I saw this dude, giant, big afro, super nice, friendly, big giant hands, and I became a Dr. J fan. And this was when the NBA was really sort of recovering from really not being what it once was, what it obviously has become. When the ABA switched into the NBA and they're going through all this sort of situation in 1976 and around that time. And I was a huge Dr. J fan. Nothing made me happier than when the Philadelphia 76ers won their first championship with Moses Malone, Cheeks, Bobby Jones, fucking Tony, and Dr. J. And then when they drafted Barkley, I thought, beautiful, beautiful. The round mound of rebound. I remember watching him play in college, and when they said that, I'm like, who is this fat fuck? Jesus Christ. And they played Olajuwon, and Olajuwon at that time was a mammoth, a monster, right? I saw him kill fucking Auburn with Barkley. Then I saw him kill LSU with Carl, the mailman Malone. And at that time, I became a huge Olajuwon fan. Still a big Olajuwon fan. Disappointed when he came to Toronto. It was pretty much at the end of his career, because it would have been great if he came to Toronto and still had a few years in him. Then we get to two real icons, and that would be Muhammad Ali. And yes, obviously I caught the tail end of Muhammad Ali's career, but because I watched sports with my father and my grandfather, who didn't get the tail end, they'd watched him from the beginning, right? And they were big fans. My dad went to the gym in Toronto to watch him spar to prepare for the Chuvalo fight. And he came to Toronto twice to fight Chuvalo. And my dad was a huge fan of Ali. And my grandfather, obviously, old school, so he appreciated great fighters. You also had Howard Cosell, who was probably the best pitchman in sports for building up an athlete and really sort of getting attention towards him, specifically after he came back after the whole Vietnam situation. But Ali was charismatic, a great smile, a nice guy. His back and forth that he had with Howard Cosell was great. I was a little too young, so I didn't notice a lot of the more negative stuff with regards to some of the things he said about Frazier and Foreman. Obviously, I didn't see the stuff with Liston, only saw it afterwards. But, and then when he ended up carrying the torch in the Atlantic Olympics, that was a very, very moving moment for a kid who grew up an Ali fan. So, I'm a big Ali fan. I'm happy that his daughter did so well in boxing and that his grandson looks pretty good. I mean, I don't know if he's going to become a champion or a superstar, but the kid's got some ability for a kid who started late and obviously is trying to capitalize a bit on his grandfather. But yeah, Ali was, you've never seen, and I don't know if you ever will see, a heavyweight that moved the way Ali did. To put it in perspective, Usyk and Ali are not that different in size. And Usyk is pretty mobile, pretty fast feet, pretty fast hands, a pretty great boxer as well. But you cannot compare Usyk to Prime Ali. Prime Ali moved like a fucking welterweight, right? His hand speed, his foot speed. I mean, this was a guy who fundamentally wasn't even the best of boxers. Could have went to the body a lot more, right? Could have been much more of a two-handed puncher, more so than he was. But the skills he had are skills we've never seen and we probably will never see again. He was a once-in-a-lifetime type of athlete. And then we get to another once-in-a-lifetime athlete. And in saying this, my favorite footballer of all time is Lionel Messi. I'm super happy he just won the World Cup. I thought it was great him coming to Miami and making such an impact on American football. I think it's great for him and his family as well, just to get away from the spotlight of Europe. Obviously, he's following in Beckham's footsteps, which makes it a much smoother sort of path for him because Beckham's already done it. But the man that made me a football fan, obviously my grandfather, who played football and was from England, so our connection were Bolton, and then my mother, who's from Liverpool, so obviously there was the connection to Liverpool. She was a huge Beatles fan, obviously coming from Liverpool, and because of that, I became a huge Liverpool fan. John Barnes and the boys back in the day. But the man who really, really, really got me interested in football, and in Canada, you didn't get to see Premier League games. The only games of football you really got to see were every 4 years for World Cup. And World Cup was obviously televised globally. And being a kid from Canada, every 4 years I got to watch football, right? Which made it that much more special, that much more precious. And of course, the man that was the man at that time was the one and only Pelé from Brazil, right? Who was a phenomenal player, an icon, right? A legendary Brazilian. And obviously has went on to represent football brilliantly in his career, right? Post-career and everything he's done since then. But Pelé, like Messi, also moved to the States to try to help build up the American game. And he went to the New York Cosmos. And when he went to the New York Cosmos, there was so much press, so much attention put on the American Football League, Soccer League, because of his joining it, that as a kid from Canada, I really obviously got caught up in that and became a huge Pelé fan and a huge Brazil fan. So obviously when World Cup happened, the team I was cheering for was always Brazil until years later when I cheered a bit for Germany, I cheered for England, I cheered for France, and I cheered for Spain. Again, when these teams had players that I liked a lot, like, obviously Spain when they had Torres and that great team. Torres was a Liverpool player. France when they obviously had Henry, which was an unbelievable Arsenal squad, but an unbelievable French team as well. Germany for quite a few years when they had Matthias, and many other great players at the time. I was never an Italian fan because I'm from Toronto. So the Italians were a little too in your face, too boisterous. And me growing up in an Italian blue collar community, it was kind of like, fuck you guys, man. And that was fine. Their attitude towards us, English, Scottish, Irish kids was also fuck you too. So, it was not a big deal. We just had different agendas at that time. But Pelé. Then we get to an icon. And everyone I mentioned really in a sense has been an icon. But this guy was an icon. So much so that they named a month after him, Mr. October. The great Reggie Jackson. And I was never a New York Yankees fan, per se. But I was always a Reggie Jackson fan. I was always cheering for Reggie Jackson. He was a behemoth, right? His towering home runs, just his personality, the attention he got as a baseball player. The fact that when the playoffs came, that's when he stepped up and was at his best. I obviously liked Nolan Ryan a lot, like as a phenomenal pitcher at that time. I really liked the Astros. I had that hat, the crazy, chimney kind of hat, the black. Pittsburgh, when obviously Willie Stargell and the boys played there as well. There's been a lot of players that I really liked, but obviously one of the earliest ones that really made an impact was Reggie Jackson, right? Mr. October. Golf, obviously my dad and my uncle were huge golfers. They golfed a lot. They loved golf. And being a kid watching golf, of course, the player you would like would be the guy that was on top of the sport, the one that had the great sort of moniker attached to him, the Golden Bear, right? And I know Tiger Woods has done a great job to try to surpass the Golden Bear, but at this point, has he? He may not have. Obviously, they're in conversation about who is the most impactful, best golfer in history. There would be some other people obviously thrown on that list as well, like Jones and others. But Jack Nicklaus obviously was a huge, significant figure in my life growing up as a young golfer. So much so that, I wanted to hit a 2-iron beautifully because Jack Nicklaus could hit a 2-iron beautifully. I still can't hit a fucking 2-iron. Can't hit it. Can't hit a 2-iron. But, Jack Nicklaus was the role model, the guy you want to be, the great putter, just a consummate professional. He's the man. I don't have any tennis players here. And I'm thinking, if it was tennis, I would have to probably say Yannick Noah. Tennis was never a sport I really liked much. I'm much more of a blue-collar kid, right? So yes, golf, because we lived near a golf course. And as blue-collar kids, we all caddied. My uncle, my dad, and me caddied, right? And because of that, obviously, we were focused on golf. But tennis was never really a sport we played because we're not upper class. And it was just not a normal sport in the community that I grew up in. But the guy that grabbed my attention was Yannick Noah, great French player, dreadlock Rasta, right? Yannick Noah, his son, obviously, who played for the Chicago Bulls, played for Florida, a great Florida fucking team. That Florida team was great. With Al Horford and obviously Noah's kid and Brewer, and I can't remember the guards, but it was a great team. But Yannick Noah was so explosive. Him on the net, his serve and volley game. He was a great player to watch as a kid because he brought real excitement to the sport. The other players that were big at that time were guys like Jimmy Connors and McEnroe, who were loudmouths and a bit fucking of dicks, right? So I never really liked either one of them, even though obviously I understood their significance. I ended up liking Pete Sampras later on, quiet killer. And my friend was a huge Lendl fan. But I think the first tennis player to really make an impact, to really sort of make me interested in tennis, was Yannick Noah, who was just explosive athlete in this game. And yeah. Speaking of that, another explosive athlete that I loved as a kid was Randall Cunningham. The guy could throw, catch, and kick with the best of them. Talk about a phenomenal athlete. That guy could have played any sport that he chose to play. Excuse me. Kind of like Marcus Allen as well. And then we get to the last person on my list, and this should be no surprise. I made a video not that long ago talking about him, and I was happy to watch this Netflix show with him, and I'm happy to see that now he's in the front office, really making an impact, helping the team do what they weren't able to do with him on the field, which is disappointing, obviously, that the management wasn't as effective as he's been in management, because you've never watched a player as dynamic as him in football before, and maybe never since. And that is obviously Barry Sanders. Barry Sanders was the epitome of a pinball fucking game, bouncing off the defenders, spinning and rolling, going, rumbling, right? Barry Sanders was always entertaining to watch, even though his team was straight up garbage. And that tells you how great he was. The fact that you could watch Detroit play, know they were going to lose, and know that they were never going to do anything. But the fact that you wanted to watch because you wanted to make sure you didn't miss Barry Sanders and the unbelievable things he was going to do. And that was Barry Sanders. Unbelievable player. I mean, obviously, as I said, Walter Payton was a huge, influence on me as a kid. But Walter Payton wasn't the dynamic type of running back that Barry Sanders was. He was much more gritty, hardcore, nose fucking to the grindstone type of guy, right? Whereas Barry Sanders was just ballet as a running back, which doesn't usually get that kind of attention. Obviously, Lynn Swann, who played for a team I also liked, the Pittsburgh Steelers, he was a guy who, was it him that did ballet in the offseason, or was it, what's his face, for the 49ers? Well, I can't think of his name. Not Lynn Swann. Jesus Christ, I can't remember. Another great, Jerry Rice, right? Another phenomenal player I grew up watching and was a big fan of. Maybe it was Jerry Rice, but it was either Lynn Swann or Jerry Rice, and they did ballet, right? So they'd have such great footwork, you know, near the lines and in the zone. And you know, if you think of like the pinball version of a ballerina, that was Barry Sanders. The guy's balance was unbelievable, unbelievable. But this is the list of not fighters, but athletes that I grew up, obviously impacted me as a kid from obviously 4 years old up. You know, the most recent of these guys is probably, and they're not all that recent. The most recent guy is probably Barry Sanders, right? He is the most recent guy on the list of players that I talked about. And Barry Sanders has been out of the game for a long time. So much so now that he's literally in the front office and they're making documentaries on Netflix about him. But that's my list. Leave it in the comment section below. What are some athletes that really impacted you as a sports fan growing up? And think about like the earliest sort of memories of people that really grabbed your attention as a young kid. Like I told you, like I had the Boston Bruins #4 jersey when I was 4 years old, right? That was the first Christmas present that I remember. Me walking around the house with, you know, the old-fashioned hockey helmet, which aren't quite what they are today. And then my jersey, and then my fucking gloves on with a stick walking around the fucking tree. Lucky I didn't fall into the tree and knock it over, but that was like my earliest memory, obviously as a sports fan. Let me know yours. Thanks for watching. Leave the comments in the comment section below. Remember to like, subscribe, and share. I appreciate it, and I'll see you next time. Peace out.